And at this time, we've got a little time. So any comments or discussion of divine omnipotence is in order, but also we can range more widely over topics if you want to discuss.
So one question that was sent in earlier was they just want a very simple rendition of your account of omnipotence. How can we explain this to
I give this in my
not?
defenders class on the attributes of God, and so they might look at those lectures. So basically you want to say that you want to give an account that considers both the degree of God's power and the range of his power. And the degree of his power is pretty easy to express. There's no state of affairs that God is incapable of actualizing due to a lack of power. Okay, so that seems to be pretty simple, don't you think? Mm-hmm. There's no state of affairs that God is incapable of actualizing due to a lack of power. That's the power component. The range component would be that God is able to actualize any state of affairs which someone in the same situation is able to actualize. God is able to actualize a state of affairs, any state of affairs which someone in the same situation is able to actualize. And what's packed into that in the same situation is having the same history up to T and being faced with the same world type that God is. These two Flint Fredoso things. But for simplicity's sake, just pack those into saying someone in the same situation. And I think that gives a rough account of the degree and the range of God's power.
The way that I put it in the chat was a being is omnipotent if it can bring about any state of affair, and I use the same language, any state of affairs that anyone can bring about.
Yeah, it has to be anyone in the same situation. He has to share the history and the same world type, same counterfactuals of creature freedom. But that's close.
That's helpful. Hunter?
Yeah, so I have two questions, very unrelated, but I've just been brewing these up, so here you go. So this is about today's topic. So do you think there's any dependent relationship between aseity and omnipotence? So I could imagine a necessarily existent being which only has the power to create universes, for example. So it doesn't seem that aseity necessarily implies omnipotence. But do you see any reason an omnipotent being would have to exist a se? And I wanted your opinion on that.
Yes, I do. And that's related to what we talked about earlier, that there cannot be more than one omnipotent being, because an omnipotent being must be able to annihilate anything else that exists. And that would imply that an omnipotent being must exist a se, and nothing else would.
Now, what if we imagine like the Platonic idea of God and abstract entities or the forms? In this sort of situation, would God still be omnipotent, even though he has these other self-existing cohorts, if you will, and therefore he doesn't have the power to create all things? For example, would we have to forfeit omnipotence?
Well, you would forfeit aseity, certainly. My inclination is to say yes, that there's something deficient in your account of omnipotence if you think there are all of these other beings that exist over which God has no power. That seems to me to be an infringement of his omnipotence.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that. I was just wondering.
Yeah, I understand.
And then my other question was off topic, but it was still on another thing you talked about a previous day about eternity.
Yes.
I've kind of always wanted to ask you this, but do you think that timelessness is a great making property? Like I think about the fleeting nature of temporality and temporal becoming, and like the past becoming further and further away, and thinking about greatest being theology. What are your thoughts on that?
I guess I have conflicting thoughts on that. I can see how being timeless would be in some ways great making, but on the other hand, it does seem to me to be a contingent property of God that he can give up if he wants to. What counts as great could be context dependent, I think, that in certain circumstances or contexts, it would be great to be timeless, but then perhaps in others, it would not.
Like with omniscience we talked about.
Yeah, so I don't think that so I guess I would put it this way. I don't think that timelessness would be a perfection, where a perfection is something that is absolutely better to have than not. On that definition of a perfection, something like courage, which seems like a perfection, wouldn't count as a perfection, because courage is not something that is absolutely better to have than not. Because if you're an omnipotent being, you don't need to be courageous. You don't have weakness. So courage is only a great-making property in the context of finite beings. So it's not a perfection, I'd say, even though it's a virtue. It's virtuous to be courageous, but it's not a perfection in the sense that it's a property that is absolutely better to have than not. And I guess in that sense, I would say the same of timelessness, that while timelessness could be advantageous in some context or other, that it's not a perfection. It's not a property that is absolutely better to have than not. And so on the view that I defend, that didn't come out in this class, I do think of God as existing timelessly without creation. It seems to me that he would have no need of time, and that would redound to his greatness, but then he condescends to create a finite temporal world so that we can have the privilege of being related to him and sharing the inner life of the Trinity as adopted sons and daughters of God.
Okay, thank you.
So, Ben, this was a question I posed earlier, but we pushed it back to now. He wants to know why we have to have time in our account of omnipotence.
Oh, well, remember, because it had to do with whether or not there are these hard facts about the past. For example, it's logically possible to destroy the Eiffel Tower, but suppose it's already been destroyed. Then you might say God has to have the power of destroying the Eiffel Tower, even though it's gone. It's not there, so he can't destroy it. So by requiring that you have to have the same history up to the time of action, you rule out having to have power over the past.
I think that's
to have
sufficient.
power over the past, you need what are called backtracking counterfactuals, where the truth of the counterfactual would require something in the past to have been different. For example, suppose you're in a skyscraper and somebody says to you, if I were to jump out the window, I would not fall to my death. And you say, come on, you're crazy. You would if you jumped out the window. He says, no, because if I jumped out the window, I would have put a safety net outside the window to catch me. So he's using a backtracking counterfactual, you see, to say, if I jump out the window, then I would have already put the safety net there in place. So if there are these kind of backtracking counterfactuals, you can imagine where God or other people might have this sort of power over the past. But this is a rather exotic notion, and so Flint and Fredoso want to allow in their account the idea that there are these hard facts about the past that are no longer accessible to our powers.
So my initial impression of your definition of omnipotence was sort of weary because I didn't get the uniqueness out of your definition, that there could only be one. And the example of, could you have multiple omnipotent beings, and then you have this tie that none of them could destroy the other necessarily, but then they would all just be maximally powerful, but not one would be omnipotent. But I think you get there because there's a state of affairs, but then if they're omnipotent or maximally powerful, it would be logically impossible to destroy. Maybe that's not true. I thought myself in a circle.
Theo, I've not thought about this. The account wasn't crafted to entail that there is and can be only one omnipotent being. I do think that's true.
Okay.
But the definition of omnipotence wasn't intended to entail uniqueness. Now, maybe it does. Like there is no state of affairs that S is unable to actualize due to a lack of power. Well, what about the state of affairs of there being another omnipotent being annihilated, or the state of affairs of annihilating another omnipotent being? He wouldn't have that power, and so he wouldn't be omnipotent. So maybe this account does imply the uniqueness of omnipotence.
I agree.
Yeah.
All right, from Robert online, actualizing a world. He has titles in all of his questions. Actualizing a world. You, Plantinga, and many other philosophers say that God will create a world with more good than evil. Is that just an assumption? Couldn't he be limited to feasible worlds with more evil than good? I'm thinking of the broad gate and the narrow gate verses, more lost than saved. Or is the fellowship with the few so great a good that it overwhelms the many lost?
Now, if I understood the last part of the question, if the good overwhelms the loss, the bad parts of it, then this is a world that is on balance good. I thought he said at first that the feasible worlds were more evil than good.
Well, he's asking you what your thoughts
end,
are. I think he's asking you whether you think the salvation of the few would be a greater good than the badness of the lost.
Yeah. Well, that's a theological question that need to be addressed in terms of his more general question. I think that Plantinga and most theists would say that if there were no feasible world available to God in which it was better, yes, there were no feasible world which was better than not, that probably God would just refrain from creation, that he wouldn't bring about a bad world, because that would be evil to do. In terms of the general question, I guess my inclination is to say that any world that a perfect being would create must be more good than bad. Now, what that implies about the salvific balance in that world, well, that then is to be discussed. But the idea that it must be more good than bad seems to me to be pretty intuitive.
There are certain Bible verses that seem to imply that God does have power over a libertarian free creature, such as, say, Proverbs 21:1, the heart of the king is in the palm of the hand of the Lord.
Right.
He can turn it like a river, whichever way he wants.
Yeah.
That would seem to imply that God has power to strongly actualize certain events of a free creature. So how would you reconcile that with the Flint and Ferduso and left out concept that would be a logical impossibility?
I interpret those passages in terms of weak actualization. I think that's how we best explain things like Pharaoh's hardening his heart and God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, or other examples in Scripture. One that I love is the suicide of Saul in Chronicles and in Samuel. In 2 Samuel, Saul, about to be taken by the Philistines, falls on his sword and commits suicide. But in the Chronicles account, the chronicler adds the comment, thus the Lord slew Saul and delivered the kingdom to David. And I thought, wow, I mean, it just cries out for a middle knowledge account. Saul is the one who committed suicide. He did the deed. And because that would probably be regarded as an evil deed, as a sin, to kill yourself, it's not something God made him do, but nevertheless, it was all within the providence of God, so that the chronicler can say, thus the Lord slew Saul and delivered the kingdom to David. So I interpret those passages scripturally in terms of weak actualization via middle knowledge.
Along with that, what was the proverb that you quoted, Quincy? Whichever way he pleases. So would you answer that saying that whichever way he pleases would be key then? Because if the king does something evil, then God must be just. And would that, so God's justice would be as he pleases in that situation. Say Saul was doing much evil.
I'm not sure I'm following the question, Bill. What is the question?
I was wondering if in that verse, is that how you would answer that as he pleases? You're using Pharaoh, for example. Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then God did as he pleased and hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah, I think that this expresses how all of these things are within the providence and sovereignty of God. Even sinful acts are permitted by God with a view toward realizing his good ends and purposes. Another wonderful biblical story is the story of Joseph and his brothers, where they commit this terrible evil against their brother that God could not have caused them to do. But at the end of the story, when Joseph finally confronts them, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good and has brought this to pass. And that, again, I think shows how even the sinful and evil acts of men can be within the providential plan of God. And a great example of this, too, would be Herod and Pilate. Says in the book of Acts chapter 4 that in this city were gathered all the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel together with Herod and Pilate to do whatever your plan and your foreknowledge had determined to take place. So that the rulers, in this case, both Roman and Jewish, though they acted freely, they did what God knew they would do within his providential plan to bring about the crucifixion.
Okay, question online from Fred. On Dr. Craig's view of divine freedom, does he mean that God lacks alternative possibilities with regards to everything? For example, to create or not to create, or just things inconsistent with his nature?
The latter, just things inconsistent with his nature, like sinning. But I think for most things, God has lots of alternative possibilities.
Options
to
between,
choose
say,
from.
one good thing and another good thing.
Yeah, think of all of the different feasible worlds that he could have actualized. So he has lots of options.
All right, let's do one more. This one should be relatively short. Christian Meister wants to know, he says, it's evident that many pastors and theologians who speak on divine eternity aren't well educated in the philosophy of time, speaking very generically about eternity. Do you think that this is a real issue?
Yes, I think that it is a problem, and it bothers me when I hear proclamations being made from the pulpit that are superficial and even self-contradictory. Now, I don't think that that means that theologians and ministers need to become philosophical theologians, not at all. But I think what they do need to do is to realize their limitations and therefore be more circumspect in what they say. It's perfectly possible with respect to divine eternity to just stick with the Bible and say the Bible teaches that God is eternal in the sense that he exists permanently without beginning or end. It's impossible for him to come into being or go out of being. And that's it. That's the end of the story, biblically. And not get into these statements where they start talking about God as beyond time, or he's going to bring time to an end, or time is in his hands, and things of this sort. I think that the theologians can do good biblical theology without becoming philosophical theologians, but they need to be more circumspect then in their assertions.
Okay, so going back to what you said earlier about how God creating a world where, the good outweighs the evil, like then it would be worth making. How would you respond to someone saying that God creating a world where evil exists, period, whether that evil outweighs the good or whether the good outweighs the evil?
Well, I'm inclined to say that God would not bring about a world in which there was evil unless there were some outweighing good. Doesn't that make sense to you, that if God is a perfectly good and loving being, that he wouldn't bring about evil unless there were some sort of a outweighing good for doing that?
I guess the reason I asked that is because some people would think that, not me, but some people I'm struggling with it, but I'm not completely on this side. That it would be better for no people to exist than for 10 people to go to heaven and one person to go to hell.
Yeah, I feel that same tug as well. That's right. It's such an awful prospect to imagine all these people being lost for eternity. But as I say, Daniel, I'm inclined to think that therefore God would not create persons who he knew would spend eternity separated from him unless there were some outweighing good for doing so. And so I believe that there is some sort of good that outweighs the loss of the wicked.
All right.
And I suspect, as you know, that it has to do with the overwhelming goodness of the salvation of those who do freely appropriate God's grace, as well as his act of redemptive self-sacrifice in the cross.
All right, someone would like a response from you on a quote from a Unitarian based on Proverbs 8. Personification of wisdom. No, this is Dan. So he says, this is the quote that he wants your thoughts on. The Incarnation is not as Trinitarians have conceived it.
Wait, the Incarnation what?
The Incarnation is not as Trinitarians have conceived it. God becoming enfleshed as a human. Rather, in John 1:14, it is God's Logos, the divine wisdom, that was enfleshed in a human being, Jesus.
Well, he's equating John's Logos with this female personification of wisdom in Proverbs 8. And that is an assumption that would need to be justified and which I think is in fact incorrect. I think it's highly implausible that John would identify Jesus with a female figure like wisdom, whereas the Logos, I think, is derived from Middle Platonism. It's not from Jewish wisdom literature, but it is a Middle Platonic notion found in Philo and other Middle Platonists, and as such, the Logos shares the divine nature, is a divine person, and it is the Logos who assumes a human nature in the Incarnation. And John is very clear about this because he calls the Logos God, ho theos, the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father. He has made him known. And then The Christological climax to the Gospel of John is Thomas's confession, my Lord and my God. Ha kurios mu kai ha theos mu, the Lord of me and the God of me. So it's very clear that for John, the Logos is God.
Okay, let's move to another question from Christian Meister. If a theophany is a manifestation of God for the purposes of interacting with humans, can we think of temporality, on your view, as a large-scale theophany?
In a sense, I guess, yeah. I think the difference would be a theophany is visual. It has the idea of, etymologically, the word is God appearing. And so with temporality, there isn't any sort of visual appearance involved. But I do think that just as a theophany is a materialization of God or a vision of God to communicate with human persons, so God's assuming a temporal status at the moment of creation is for the purpose of being related to his creation.
Fred Heiberg says, are the names Father, Son, Spirit of the divine persons grounded in their economical roles? Since you reject the processions, what would the persons be called before or sans creation?
That's my inclination, is to say that these are names of these three equal persons in view of the different roles they play in the plan of salvation, that is, in the economic Trinity. So the Father is the person who sends the Son. The Son is the person who becomes incarnate and dies on the cross to redeem mankind. The Holy Spirit is the person who takes the place of the Son in empowering and guiding the Christian church. And I think there's some warrant for that in Scripture. In Luke's story of the Annunciation to Mary, he says, the Holy Spirit will come upon you so that the holy thing that is born of you will be called the Son of God. So it is in virtue of the virgin conception that Christ is God's Son, which would make it part of the economic Trinity. That's my inclination.
Okay, from Steve Kreutz. I don't think he's asked the question yet. He says, he even said, no need to ask this, but I find it interesting. Could God have become incarnate if he were only one person? Since Jesus gave up the conscious exercise of certain powers, was he able to take on a human nature only because the Father and the Spirit could run the universe while he was temporarily limited? Weird question, but I really wonder about it.
Yeah, it is a weird question, and I'm inclined to say that the Logos, even while incarnate, was still running the world and knowing what's going on. Tom Morris, in his book, The Logic of God Incarnate, has some really good reflections on this, where he thinks of the human consciousness of the Logos as embedded in or encompassed by a broader consciousness of the divine Logos, so that it's a part of it. And so I don't think we should think that the divine Logos is somehow extinguished during the incarnation in terms of what he knows and is aware of.
Okay, how about one more question? From Christian Meister, the second person of the Trinity is contingently incarnate. The Son became incarnate, the Father did not. If temporality is contingent, why must all three persons of the Trinity have the exact same relationship to time?
Well, for one thing, because God is one. There's only one being here that we're talking about. There's one substance, God, and that substance comes into causal relationship with the universe, of sustaining the universe in being, and even just coexisting with the universe, which requires temporality. And then also God is omniscient, and so he must know tensed facts. And so all three of the persons being equally omniscient must all know tensed facts. You couldn't have one of the persons being less than omniscient. So it seems to me that this is an all or nothing affair. You have to be very careful about not rending the Trinity into pieces by making part of it, say, temporal and other parts of it atemporal. I don't think that's even possible, since we are dealing with one substance, one being.